There is a ship in Stockholm that has stood dry and whole in the same quiet hall for longer than most people alive today have been breathing, and yet under her own sails she travelled a distance you could walk before you grew tired of walking. She's the largest and most complete survivor of her century anywhere in the world, a mountain of carved oak crowned with painted lions and gilded emperors, a vessel that has outlasted the kingdom that made her and the wars she was built to win, and she earned that strange immortality by failing more completely than almost any great ship ever built. Her name is Vasa, and she sank on a calm and sunlit afternoon, in full view of a watching city, before she had passed beyond the mouth of her own harbour. That is the paradox that holds this whole story together, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go back to the beginning, because it is the key to everything that follows. The ships that succeeded in the great age of sail wore themselves out. They fought, and they carried, and they laboured across oceans until their timbers softened and their seams opened, and then they were broken up for firewood or left to rot in some forgotten backwater, and almost nothing of them remains. Vasa did none of that. She was so beautiful and so proud and so fatally ill-made that she rolled over and went to the bottom on her very first afternoon at sea, and because she failed so early she was preserved so perfectly. The catastrophe and the miracle are the same event seen from two ends of time. To understand how a thing like that could happen, we have to travel back almost 4 centuries, to a northern kingdom that was rising fast and reaching far beyond its means, to a young and restless king who wanted a navy worthy of his ambitions, and to a shipyard on the edge of a cold grey city where hundreds of men spent the better part of 3 years raising the most magnificent warship anyone in the Baltic had ever seen. We will watch the forest fall for her. We will watch the great hull take shape on the slipway, plank by curving plank, and we will meet the men who shaped it, the master shipwright who fell ill and died before his work was done, and the sculptors who covered nearly every surface she owned with kings and mermaids and lions and beasts. We will stand on her decks as she was fitted with rows of heavy bronze guns, more than any ship of her kind had carried before, mounted higher than was wise. We will feel, as the men aboard her must have felt, the first faint uneasiness that something about her was not quite right, the way she leaned and lingered when she should have stood upright. And then we will follow her out onto the water on the 10th day of August in the year 1628, for the few short minutes that were all the sailing she would ever do. It is a story about ambition in the end, and about the distance between what we dream and what wood and water will actually allow. It is a story about a king who wanted the impossible and very nearly got it, and about the quiet, patient arithmetic of the sea, which does not care how many lions are carved upon a hull, or how many emperors gaze out from its stern. And it is a story with a long and gentle second half, because Vasa did not vanish. She lay in the cold, dark, brackish water of Stockholm harbour for more than 300 years, forgotten by almost everyone, protected by the very coldness and stillness that had swallowed her, until in the middle of the last century, a patient man with a homemade sampling tool went looking for her and found her and brought her back into the light. So this is not only the tale of a sinking, it is the tale of a resurrection, of a ship that went down in minutes and took 3 centuries and a great deal of tenderness to raise again. Before we go further, if you find that stories like this one settle your mind and slow your breathing, you're welcome to follow along quietly for more voyages of the great ships of history in the evenings to come. There is no need to do anything but rest and listen. For now, let us simply return to the beginning, to a kingdom on the northern edge of Europe, and to the ambitions that first set this ship afloat. The Sweden into which Vasa was born was not the placid, comfortable country a modern traveller might imagine. It was a hard land of long winters and short summers, of pine and birch and iron-cold water, thinly settled, poor in many of the things that made other nations rich, but possessed in those years of an energy and a hunger that would carry it, within a generation or two, to a place among the great powers of Europe entirely out of proportion to its size. The kingdom had emerged not long before from a bitter century of struggle. It had broken free of the old union that had bound the Scandinavian crowns together, and the family that had led that break, the House of Vasa, had given the country both its independence and its royal line. It was for this dynasty, this proud and combative family that had made itself the heart of the Swedish state, that the great ship would eventually be named, and the name carried with it a whole freight of meaning, of pride and legitimacy, and the will to endure. At the head of the kingdom in these years sat a young man who would become one of the most admired soldiers of his age, remembered long afterward as the Lion of the North. He had come to the throne as little more than a boy, and he had inherited along with the crown a tangle of wars on every side. To the east lay a vast and ancient rival, with whom the Swedes contested the shores and trade of the Baltic. To the south, across the water, lay another old enemy, and beyond them stretched the sprawling, smoking chaos of a continent tearing itself apart in a religious war that would last for a generation and drain whole provinces of their people. The young king was clever, tireless, and genuinely gifted in the arts of war and government, and he understood something that many rulers of larger and richer countries did not. He understood that in the north, power flowed along the water. Whoever commanded the Baltic commanded the trade in grain and timber and iron and tar that fed the armies of Europe. Whoever commanded the Baltic could move soldiers swiftly to any threatened shore, could blockade an enemy's ports, could tax the ships that passed through the narrow straits at the sea's mouth. And to command the sea, a kingdom needed a navy, and a navy needed ships, and not merely many ships, but great ones. Ships that could dominate a line of battle and awe a watching enemy into caution before a single shot was fired. So the king wanted ships, and he wanted them quickly, and he wanted them grand. This was not simple vanity, though vanity was certainly part of it, as it is part of most great building. A warship in that century was many things at once. It was a weapon, a floating fortress bristling with guns. It was a transport capable of carrying soldiers and their supplies to distant coasts. It was a symbol, a statement carved and painted and gilded, meant to be read by everyone who saw it, allies and enemies alike, as a declaration of the wealth and the seriousness and the divine favour of the crown that had built it. The greatest ships of the age were among the most expensive objects a state could produce, more costly than palaces, and they were meant to look it. When one of them sailed into a foreign harbour, or lay at anchor where ambassadors could see it, it spoke on behalf of a whole kingdom, and it said, in a language everyone understood, that here was a power to be reckoned with. The young king of Sweden, waging his wars on land and sea, understood the value of such a statement perhaps better than anyone, and he meant to make it in oak and bronze and gold on a scale the Baltic had never seen. The decision to build the ship we now call Vasa did not come out of nothing, and it did not come as a single command. It grew out of years of steady effort to build up the Swedish fleet, out of contracts and negotiations and the slow gathering of skilled men and good timber. In the years before her keel was laid, the Crown had been ordering ships in numbers, replacing losses, and reaching out across the sea to find the expertise it needed. For shipbuilding of the highest order was a craft that Sweden did not yet fully command on its own. The most accomplished builders of great ships in that age were the Dutch, whose small, wet, industrious country had made itself the workshop and the trading heart of northern Europe. Dutch shipwrights knew how to raise a large hull. Dutch merchants knew where to find the ropes and the sailcloth and the pitch and the iron that a fleet consumed. And so it was to a Dutch master, settled and working in Stockholm, that the crown turned when it wanted its greatest ships. His name was Henrik Hubertsson, and together with his brother he had taken on the running of the naval yard, contracting to build vessels for the king in exchange for the rights and the payments that such work brought. He was, by all the evidence that survives, a capable and experienced man, trusted with the most important commissions the kingdom had to offer, and it was into his hands that the building of the great ship was placed. The yard where the work would be done lay on the waterfront of the capital, on a strip of land beside the cold flowing channels that thread through the city. It was a place of noise and smoke and ceaseless labour, of saw pits and forges and long racks of drying timber, of the smell of tar and fresh-cut oak and the sea. Here the ordinary business of a naval dockyard went on from dawn to dusk, the building and repairing of the ships that carried Sweden's power out across the water, and here, over the space of some years, the greatest of them all would slowly take shape. The contract that governed the work called, in its first form, for more than one ship, for great vessels and smaller ones together, and the plans shifted and grew as such plans often did, as the king's wishes and the fortunes of war altered what was wanted. This is one of the threads that runs quietly through the whole story of the ship, and it is worth holding on to. She was not built to a single fixed and finished design, calmly agreed upon, and then patiently executed. She was built in a time of pressure and changing demands, by men working partly from experience and partly from rule of thumb, on a scale that pushed against the edge of what any of them had done before, and to specifications that did not stay still while the work was underway. It is important here to be honest about how ships of this kind were actually designed, because it explains a great deal of what came later, and because it is easy to imagine the process as far more exact than it truly was. There were in that century no reliable calculations by which a builder could work out in advance whether a given hull would float upright and steady or roll dangerously in a breeze. The science that would one day allow such things to be predicted on paper did not yet exist in any usable form. A master shipwright carried his knowledge in his hands and his memory, and in the traditions passed down to him, in a set of proportions and habits that had produced good ships before. He would fix certain key measurements, the length of the keel, the breadth of the hull, the depth from deck to hold, and from these, by custom and by eye, the rest of the vessel would follow. If the proportions he chose were sound, and if they were not stretched too far beyond the ships he had built successfully in the past, the result would very likely swim well enough. But if the proportions were pushed, if a hull were made unusually tall, or unusually narrow, or loaded with unusual weight high above the water, there was no calculation to warn him, and no way to know for certain how she would behave until she was finished and afloat. The builders of that age were sailing, in a sense, without instruments, guided only by experience and the accumulated wisdom of their trade, and when they ventured into territory where that experience ran thin, they were guessing, however skillfully. Into this uncertain art came the king's desire for something greater than had been built before, and it is at this point that one of the enduring debates about the ship begins, a debate that the honest telling of the story must leave open rather than resolve. It has long been said, and it may well be true, that the design of the ship changed while she was being built, that she was begun on one set of dimensions and then altered to another, longer or differently proportioned than first intended, and that additional weight was added high in the vessel as the plans grew grander. It has been said that the king himself, away at his wars and impatient for his fleet, pressed for changes, for more guns and a more imposing ship, and that the builders, unable to refuse their sovereign, did as they were bid even where their judgment might have counselled otherwise. How much of this is firmly established, and how much is later reconstruction is not entirely certain, and careful historians are cautious about laying the whole disaster at the door of any single decision or any single person. What does seem clear from the record is that the ship ended up carrying a very great deal of weight high above the waterline, more than her breadth could comfortably balance, and that somewhere in the tangled process of ordering and building and altering, the fatal imbalance was designed into her. Whether it came from a royal command, from a builder's error, from the confusion of shifting plans, or from all of these together, is one of the questions that the surviving evidence does not fully answer, and it is more honest to name it as an open question than to pretend to a certainty the record does not support. There is a further and rather poignant complication in the story of the ship's making, and it is a human one. The master shipwright who had been entrusted with the great vessel, the experienced Dutchman in whose hands the whole enterprise rested, did not live to see her finished. He fell ill during the years of the building, gravely and lingeringly ill, and for a long stretch of the most important work he was unable to be present at the yard as a master must, to watch every stage and make every judgment and correct every fault before it hardened into the timber. In time he died, well before the ship was ready for the water, and the completion of the work passed to another man, a capable assistant who had worked under him, and who now had to bring to a finish a vessel he had not begun, built partly to a design and to intentions that had lived most fully in the mind of a man now gone. It is not hard to imagine the difficulty of that inheritance, to be handed the largest and most important ship in the kingdom, half built, with the king waiting and the plans uncertain, and the original master no longer there to consult. Whatever errors had been built into her by then were already deep in her structure, past easy changing, and the new master could only carry the work forward as best he could along the lines already set. It is one of the quiet tragedies embedded in the larger one, this passing of the great task from a dying man to a living one, and it reminds us that behind the grand story of kings and navies there were always particular people, with their illnesses and their burdens and their limits, doing difficult work under pressure and hoping it would hold. Before a single plank of such a ship could be shaped, there had to be timber, and the gathering of it was itself an undertaking of great scale, a slow harvest that reached out from the shipyard into the forests of the kingdom and beyond. A warship of this size devoured wood in quantities that are difficult to picture. Something on the order of 1,000 oak trees went into her. Whole forests of mature timber felled and hauled and floated and stacked, and not just any oak would do. The shipwrights needed particular kinds of wood for particular parts of the vessel, and much of what they needed had to be found, already grown into roughly the right shape, for in an age before the machinery that could bend and force great beams to a builder's will, the curves of a ship were sought in the natural curves of the growing tree. The long straight timbers of the keel and the planking came from tall, clean-grown trunks, but the ribs that gave the hull its shape, the knees and brackets that braced deck to side, the great curved pieces that framed the bow and the stern, these were best cut from trees that had grown with a natural bend, from the fork where a heavy limb met the trunk from oaks that had leaned and twisted as they grew. Men who knew what to look for went out into the woods searching for exactly these shapes, marking trees that had the right curve locked into their grain, and the felling of them was a considered thing, a matching of the shapes the ship required to the shapes the forest had happened to produce. Once felled, the timber had to be brought to the water, and then along the water to the yard, and this too was labour of a heavy and patient kind. Great logs were dragged by teams of oxen and horses over frozen ground in winter, when the hard, cold surface made the hauling easier, and floated down rivers and along the coast in rafts when the ways were open. It arrived at the shipyard green and heavy and full of sap, and much of it would have been better for years of seasoning, for slow drying that let the wood settle and stabilise before it was worked. But there was not always time for such patience. The king wanted his ship, and the pressures of the war and the crown's impatience meant that timber was sometimes used sooner than a careful builder might have wished, worked while it was still fresher than ideal. This is another of the small imperfections that gathered quietly around the making of the great vessel, none of them alone enough to doom her, but each adding its little weight to the sum. Wood cut and worked too green may shrink and shift as it dries afterward, opening seams, loosening fastenings, and a hull is only as sound as the fit of its countless parts. At the yard, the timber met the men, and the men were many. The building of a great warship was among the largest concentrations of skilled and unskilled labour that a pre-industrial society produced in one place, and the workforce that raised the ship was a small town in itself, drawn from many trades and, in that cosmopolitan age of shipbuilding, from many lands. There were the shipwrights proper, the master and his assistants, and the skilled carpenters who shaped the great timbers and fitted them one to another. There were sawyers who cut the planks in deep saw pits, one man standing above and one below in the dust and the falling sawdust, working the long two-handed saws down the length of a log. There were smiths at their forges, hammering out the thousands of iron bolts and fastenings and fittings the ship required, the anchors and the chains and the countless nails. There were caulkers who drove tarred fibre into every seam between the planks and paid it over with hot pitch to keep the sea out. There were riggers and rope makers and sail makers, and later the sculptors and painters and gilders who would turn a functional hull into a floating work of art. Some of these men were Swedish, some were Dutch, some came from the German lands or elsewhere, and among them they carried the knowledge of the trade in a dozen tongues and traditions. They worked through the long summer days and the short bitter winter ones, in the cold and the wet, on scaffolding high above the ground at heavy and often dangerous labour, and the great hull rose slowly among them season by season. To watch that hull take shape over the months would have been to watch a thing of extraordinary size assemble itself out of individual pieces of wood, each one shaped by hand. First there was the keel, the long backbone of the ship laid down on the blocks of the slipway, a massive timber or set of timbers running the length of the vessel and forming the foundation on which everything else was raised. To it were joined the stem at the bow and the stern post at the stern, the great upright members that framed the two ends of the ship and gave her the curve of her prow and the tall flat face of her stern. Then came the ribs, the frames, the curved timbers rising in pairs from the keel like the bones of some enormous creature, each one shaped to the exact curve the hull required at that point along its length, closely spaced, forming the skeleton over which the skin of the ship would be laid. As the frames went up, the shape of the vessel became visible for the first time, a vast basket of curved oak standing on the slipway, and one could begin to see how broad she would be, how deep, how tall, and how the lines of her would flow from the sharp entry of the bow to the wide swell of her midsection, and back to the towering structure of the stern. Over this skeleton the planking was laid, the longboards of the hull bent and fastened to the frames, plank above plank from the keel upward, each one shaped and steamed and forced into its place and fixed with iron and wooden fastenings, the seams between them waiting to be caulked. Inside, a second skin of planking lined the frames, so that the hull was in effect a thick sandwich of oak, outer planking and inner planking with the heavy frames between, a wall of wood strong enough to carry the weight of the guns and to stand, it was hoped, against the shot of an enemy. Decks were laid across the hull at their several levels, supported on great beams that ran from side to side, and it was in the arrangement of these decks that so much of the ship's fate was quietly decided. For it was here that the builders set the levels at which the rows of heavy guns would stand, and it was the height of those guns above the water, more than almost anything else, that would determine whether she floated steady or rolled to her doom. But that reckoning still lay ahead. In the years of the building, the ship was simply a great and growing presence at the yard, larger than anything around her, drawing the eyes of everyone who passed along the waterfront, a swelling promise of the power and the glory she was meant one day to carry out onto the sea. There is something moving in the sheer patience of it all, in the thought of those hundreds of men returning day after day, season after season, to add their small labours to the growing whole, most of them never to be named or remembered, their skill and their sweat vanishing into the finished ship as the individual brushstrokes vanish into a painting. They could not have known, as they worked, what would become of the great vessel they were raising. To them she was a job of work, a source of wages, a source perhaps of pride, the largest and grandest thing they had ever helped to build. They shaped her timbers and drove her fastenings and caulked her seams, and never imagined that the fruit of all their labour would sail for only a matter of minutes before going to the bottom, and that this very disaster would, across the long centuries, preserve their work more perfectly than any success could have done, so that we can stand today amid the timbers they cut and fitted and see, in the very grain of the wood, the marks of the tools they held in their hands. As the ship grew, so did the ambition invested in her, and the heart of that ambition, the thing that set her apart from the ordinary run of warships, lay in her guns and in where the builders chose to put them. For most of the history of the sailing warship, the standard great vessel of the line carried its main battery on a single covered gun deck, a long row of heavy cannon along each side firing out through ports cut in the hull. This was the arrangement that experience had proved, the balance of firepower and stability that generations of builders and captains had settled upon as workable. But the age was one of rising ambition in naval armament, of a hunger for ships that could bring ever more guns to bear, and the great vessel building at the Stockholm yard was to embody that hunger. She was to carry not one but two full gun decks, one above the other, each lined with heavy cannon, so that a single broadside from her would hurl a weight of iron far beyond what a lesser ship could manage. It was a magnificent conception, and a genuinely formidable one. A ship so armed would dominate any single opponent she was likely to meet, and would tower over the water as a fortress afloat. But it carried within it from the very first the seed of the disaster to come, and the seed was this. 2 decks of heavy guns meant a very great weight of bronze and timber carried high in the ship, well above the waterline, and weight carried high is the enemy of stability in any vessel that must stand upright under sail. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to think for a moment about how a ship stays upright at all, in plain terms and without any need for calculation. A sailing ship floating on the water is always being tipped to one side or the other, by the wind pressing on her sails, by the roll of the waves, by any shift of weight aboard her. What brings her back upright, what keeps her from simply rolling over at the first strong gust, is the way her weight and her buoyancy are arranged. If most of her heavy weight is low down, near the keel, deep in the hull, then when she leans to one side, that low weight acts to swing her back upright, like the weighted base of a toy that always rights itself. But if too much of her weight is carried high, up in the tall structure of her upper decks and her guns and her towering stern, then leaning becomes dangerous. For the high weight, once the ship tips past a certain point, no longer helps to right her, but instead drags her further over. Everything the builders piled high in the great ship, the second deck of guns, the heavy carved and gilded stern castle rising story upon story, the tall masts and their weight of rigging added to the danger, and everything they could put low, chiefly the stone ballast in the very bottom of the hold, was needed to counter it. The whole question of whether she would swim safely came down, in the end, to this balance between weight high and weight low, and it was a balance that, as events would show, had been fatally misjudged. There was, moreover, a cruel trap built into the situation, one that would emerge fully only when it was far too late to matter. The obvious answer to a ship that leans too easily is to add more ballast, more stone low in the hold, to bring her weight down and steady her. But the great ship's hull had a particular shape and a particular depth, and her lower row of gun ports, the openings for the cannon of her lower deck, sat only a certain distance above the water. If enough ballast had been added to make her truly steady, to bring that low weight down far enough to counter all the weight she carried high, then she would have floated so much deeper in the water that her lower gun ports would have come dangerously close to the surface, or even below it, so that any lean at all would have let the sea come pouring in through them. To make her stable, in other words, would have been to make her unable to use her lower guns without flooding, and a two-decked warship that could not open her lower gun ports was no two-decked warship at all. She was caught, as it were, between two impossibilities. Too little ballast and she was top-heavy and prone to capsize. Too much, and she was too low and prone to swamp. The truth, though no one could prove it on paper at the time, was that the hull was simply too narrow and too shallow for all the weight and all the height that had been built upon it. She needed to have been broader in the beam, or lower in her upper works, or lighter in her armament, and she was none of these things. The proportions had been pushed past what the builder's experience could safely carry into the uncharted territory where their rule of thumb no longer held, and there was no calculation to warn them how far past the edge they had gone. It would be wrong, though, to imagine that the men who built her were fools, or that the danger was obvious to everyone at the time in the way it can seem obvious to us now, looking back with the knowledge of what happened. They were skilled and experienced craftsmen working at the very limit of their art, on a scale that had rarely or never been attempted under pressure, to shifting plans with a great man now dead who had carried much of the original vision in his head. The signs that something was wrong were real, but they were the kind of signs that experienced men can talk themselves past, especially when a king is waiting and the whole weight of a kingdom's expectation is pressing on the work. A slight tenderness in the way she sat at her moorings, a tendency to lean a little far and return a little slowly, could be read as something that would settle once she was properly ballasted and rigged and trimmed, as new ships often needed to be. There is a very human tendency, when a great deal has already been invested in a course of action, and turning back would be ruinously costly and shaming, to hope that the trouble will resolve itself, to find reasons why the warning signs need not mean what they seem to mean. Something of that hopefulness, that reluctance to face an unwelcome truth about a nearly finished and enormously expensive ship, seems to hang over the final months of her fitting out. The problem was there, built deep into her from the keel up, and some aboard sensed it, but it was easier to press on than to admit that the pride of the fleet might be dangerously, perhaps fatally, ill-made. And so the great ship neared completion, carrying within her, invisible to any casual eye, the precise flaw that would destroy her. From the outside she was a wonder, growing more magnificent by the week as the carvers and painters went to work, the largest and most splendid vessel the Baltic had ever seen, and everyone who looked upon her must have felt a swell of pride and anticipation. But beneath the beauty lay the arithmetic of weight and water that no one could yet read with certainty. The too narrow hull, the too high guns, the ballast that could not be enough without being too much, all of it waiting quietly for the day she would spread her sails and the wind would deliver its verdict. There is a particular kind of sorrow in knowing, as we do, what those hopeful, hard-working men did not, and in watching the ship advance so proudly toward a launching that would also be, within the span of a single afternoon, her ending. But that afternoon was still some way off, and before we come to it there is a great deal more to see, for the ship in these last months of her making was becoming not only a weapon but a work of art, and it is to that astonishing surface, to the lions and the emperors and the whole gilded army of carved figures that clothed her, that we turn next. If the guns were the ship's argument, the carvings were her poetry, and no one who saw her in her finished glory could have doubted that here was a vessel meant to overwhelm the eye as much as the enemy. In the last stages of her building, an army of sculptors and painters and gilders descended upon her, and they clothed nearly every surface that could bear an image with a dense and dazzling population of carved figures, hundreds upon hundreds of them, so many that the ship, and above all her towering stern, became a kind of floating cathedral of wood, crowded with kings and gods and beasts and heroes. The carvers worked in oak and in softer woods, cutting their figures sometimes half in the round, projecting boldly from the surface, and the whole ornate multitude was then painted in strong, bright colours and picked out here and there with gold, so that in the sunlight she must have blazed. For a long time it was imagined that she had been almost entirely gilded, a ship of gold from stem to stern, but closer study of the surviving traces of paint has shown that the truth was richer and stranger than that. A riot of vivid colour, deep reds and blues and greens and yellows, against which the gilding gleamed at the most important points. She was not a golden ship so much as a painted one, brilliant and gaudy by the standards of a later, quieter taste, meant to be read like a great illustrated book by everyone who looked upon her. And she was, in a real sense, a book, or an argument made in images, for the carvings were not mere decoration but a carefully composed programme of meaning, designed to proclaim the glory and the legitimacy and the divine favour of the crown that had built her. Everywhere upon her were figures drawn from the shared image world of that age, from the Bible and from the myths and history of ancient Roman Greece, from the heraldry of the royal house, and from the deep well of symbol and allegory that educated people of the time could read as fluently as words. There were Roman emperors ranged in their ranks, lending the borrowed authority of antiquity to the northern king. There were figures from scripture, and warriors and heroes, and creatures of the sea, mermaids and tritons and sea monsters, and grotesque faces and twining foliage, and every kind of ornament the carver's art could produce. There were symbols of the royal family and of the kingdom, the emblems by which the House of Vasa and the Swedish crown made themselves known. The whole ensemble was meant to say to anyone who stood before that stern and looked up, that the power behind this ship was ancient and rightful and blessed, that it stood in the great line of empires, that it was favoured by heaven and destined for greatness. In an age when most people could not read, and when the images on a great ship might be seen by thousands, this was propaganda of the most sophisticated kind, statecraft carved in oak, and it was among the most ambitious such programmes ever set upon a ship. Above all, and set at the very prow where it would lead her out onto the water, there was the lion. The great figurehead of the ship was a lion, springing forward, a huge carved beast several times the size of a man, poised at the head of the vessel as if leaping across the waves, and it carried a weight of meaning that everyone of that time would have grasped at once. The lion was the emblem of the king himself, the great soldier king who was even then earning across Europe the name by which history would remember him, a name that spoke of a lion of the north. To place a lion at the head of the greatest ship of his fleet was to send the king himself out upon the sea in symbol, to make the vessel an extension of his person and his power, a roaring golden-maned declaration that here came the might of Sweden. The lion at the bow and the crowded emperors at the stern framed the whole ship between two statements of royal glory, and everything between was worked to the same end. She was not simply a ship that happened to be decorated, she was a decoration that happened to be a ship, a total work of art in the service of a single overwhelming message about the majesty of the crown. It's worth pausing to think about the men who made all this, the sculptors and their apprentices who spent months bent over blocks of wood, coaxing out of them these hundreds of figures, and the painters who then brought them to life in colour. They were craftsmen of high skill, many of them trained in the rich traditions of the German lands and the Low Countries, where the carving of such ornament was a developed and honoured art, and they worked to designs and to a programme that would have been overseen by those who understood the meanings to be conveyed. Their labour was enormous, and it was, in the cruel event, among the most nearly wasted labour imaginable, for the ship on which they lavished it would sail for only minutes before carrying their work to the bottom of the sea. And yet, in the deepest of ironies, it is precisely because she sank that their work survives at all. Had the ship lived out a normal career, fought her battles, worn herself out, and been broken up in the end, these carvings would have gone the way of nearly all such ornament, scattered, decayed, burned, lost. Instead, they went down with her into the cold, dark water that would preserve them, and much of that great carved multitude endured, so that today it is possible to stand before the very figures those craftsmen cut, and to see their art almost as they left it, the single, most complete survival of the ship-carver's craft from that whole vanished age. There is a strange kind of tenderness in that survival, in the thought of all those anonymous hands and the small marvels they made, kept safe through the centuries by the very catastrophe that seemed to destroy them. When the ship was raised at last and the mud and the darkness fell away, There emerged into the light not only a hull, but a whole gallery of faces. The emperors still gazing out, the lions still snarling, the mermaids and monsters and heroes still crowding the woodwork, dimmed and darkened by their long immersion but astonishingly whole. It is as if the sea, having taken the ship, agreed to keep her carvings as a kind of trust, holding them in its cold safekeeping until a distant age should come to reclaim them, and so the propaganda outlived the power it was made to serve. The kingdom that carved these lions to proclaim its glory would rise and shine and fade, its brief age of greatness passing as all such ages pass, and yet the lions endure, no longer proclaiming anything to anyone, simply beautiful, simply old, the work of forgotten hands preserved beyond all reasonable hope by the accident of disaster. The ship's makers meant her carvings to speak of a power that would last forever. The power did not last, but in a way they could never have foreseen, the carvings very nearly have. For now, though, in the last weeks of her fitting out, she stood at the yard in all her painted brilliance, complete or very nearly so, a wonder of colour and gold rising above the grey water of the harbour, and the day was drawing near when she would at last be made ready to sail. To walk the great ship from keel to masthead, in imagination, is to grasp how much of a world she contained, and how many kinds of life were meant to unfold within her wooden walls. She was, in the measure of her time, an enormous thing. Her hull rising many times the height of a man from the water, her masts towering far above that, so that from the surface of the sea to the top of her mainmast was a height to make one dizzy, and her length was such that a good number of men could have stretched head to foot along her deck. Deep in her belly, below everything else, lay the hold, and there in the very bottom rested the ballast, the tons of stone whose whole purpose was to weigh her down and steady her, though as we have seen there was not enough of it, and could not have been enough without drowning her lower guns. Around and above the ballast were stored the provisions and the water and the powder and shot and all the countless things a warship needed to keep her people fed and fighting, the barrels and casks and chests that turned her into a self-sufficient community, able to keep the sea for weeks or months at a time. Above the hold came the gun decks, the reason for her existence, and it was here that her character as a fighting machine was most fully expressed. On the lower gun deck stood the heaviest of her cannon, the great bronze pieces that would hurl the largest shot, ranged in a long row down each side of the ship, each one at its port, each one served by its crew. Above them, on the upper gun deck, stood a second row, and the presence of these two full tiers of heavy guns was the ship's great boast, and though no one yet knew it, her doom. To stand on one of those gun decks would have been to find oneself in a long, low, dim world of oak and iron and rope, the beams close above the head, the guns crouching at their ports along the sides, the light coming in shafts through the gun ports when they were open, everything smelling of tar and wood and powder and the sea. In battle, these decks would become places of deafening noise and choking smoke and terrible danger, the guns leaping back against their ropes as they fired, the crews sweating to reload, the air thick and the enemy's shots smashing through the sides. In peace they were the working heart of the ship, and for many of her crew, their home, the place where they ate and slept and lived out the long, uneventful stretches that made up most of any sailor's life. For the ship was not only guns and carvings, she was also people, or was meant to be, a floating community of a size that must be reckoned in the many dozens, and, in time of full war service with soldiers embarked, in the hundreds. There were the sailors who worked the ship, the men who climbed the rigging and handled the sails and steered her and kept her afloat, skilled in the hard and dangerous craft of the sea. There were the gunners who served the great cannon, a specialist trade of its own. There were the officers who commanded, and beneath them the petty officers and mates who saw that orders were carried out. There were boys, some very young, who ran messages and did the small tasks of the ship and learned the trade from the bottom up. There would have been, in time, soldiers carried for the fighting on land or the boarding of enemy ships, and the various tradesmen a ship needed, the carpenter and his mates to keep her hull and spars in repair, the cook at his galley, the men who tended the sick. All these were meant to live together within her wooden walls, in the cramped and shared and largely comfortless conditions of a warship of that age, sleeping where they could, eating simple food from common vessels, ordering their days by the watches and the bells, a whole society in miniature bound within the curving sides of the hull. It is one of the quiet poignancies of the ship's story that on her one and only voyage she carried aboard her, Not only her working crew, but also, by the custom of such maiden occasions, a number of others, wives and children and guests, come to share in the pride and the celebration of the great ship's first sailing. A maiden voyage was an event, a moment of triumph and festivity, and it was usual for the families of the crew and various onlookers to be permitted aboard for the beginning of it, before the ship reached the open water where they would be set ashore, and the real business of the voyage would commence. So the ship that set out that day carried a fuller and more varied human freight than she ever would again. Ordinary people caught up in the excitement of the occasion come to see their men off and to feel the deck of the wonderful new ship beneath their feet, with no thought that they were stepping into danger. That detail, more than almost any other, gives the disaster its particular human weight. For among those who would find themselves in the water when she went down were not hardened sailors alone, but people who had come only to celebrate, and some of them would not come out again. Above the gun decks rose the upper works of the ship. The weather deck opened to the sky where much of the sailing was done, and then, toward the stern, the rising structure of the aftercastle, the tall stories of cabins and galleries that housed the officers and provided the grand spaces of the ship, and that carried, on their outer face, the great crowded programme of carvings we have already seen. This towering stern was among the most imposing features of the vessel, and among the most dangerous, for all its height and weight stood far above the water and added grievously to the burden she carried high. From the galleries of the stern the officers could look out over the sea in a kind of floating grandeur, and the whole structure proclaimed, in its very height and ornament, the dignity of the ship and the crown she served. But every story of that proud stern was weight where weight could least be afforded, and the same was true of the masts and the great weight of rigging, and, when set, of sail that they carried, all of it high, all of it pressing on the delicate balance that held her upright. She was, in the end, a ship in which almost everything that made her magnificent, the 2 decks of guns, the towering carved stern, the tall masts and broad sails, also made her unstable, so that her grandeur and her fragility were one and the same thing, and the very features that drew every eye in admiration were the features that would, on a bright afternoon in August, roll her over and send her down. But all of that still lay a little way ahead, for now she was nearing readiness, a whole world contained in oak, waiting to be filled with the life she was built to carry, and there remained only the final labours of arming her and provisioning her, and, above all, of testing whether she could safely do the one thing she had been made to do, which was to stand upright and sail. The guns that the great ship was built to carry deserve a closer look of their own, for they were among the costliest and most impressive things about her, and they tell us a great deal about the kind of power the kingdom was reaching for. She was designed to bear a large number of cannon, the great majority of them heavy pieces of a single main type, so that her armament had a uniformity and a concentration of weight that made her, on paper, a match for anything afloat. These were not iron guns of the cheaper sort, but bronze, cast in the foundries with great skill and at great expense, gleaming pieces of considerable length and enormous weight, each one a small fortune in metal and labour, each one capable of throwing a heavy ball of iron across the water with force enough to smash the side of an enemy ship. To arm her fully with such pieces was to invest in her a treasure in bronze, and it is a measure of the seriousness of the whole enterprise that the Crown was willing to pour such wealth into a single vessel. The guns were among the most valuable things she carried, so valuable, indeed, that when she sank, the recovery of them would become a matter of urgent concern long before anyone thought of raising the ship herself, and much ingenuity would be spent decades later on bringing those precious bronze pieces back up from the deep. To make and mount so many heavy guns was a great undertaking in itself, quite apart from the building of the ship. The casting of bronze cannon was a specialised and difficult art, the founder working with molten metal in his furnace, casting each great piece in its mould, then boring and finishing it to make it true. Each gun had then to be mounted on its carriage, a heavy wooden frame on small wheels that allowed it to be run out to its port for firing, and hauled back inboard for loading, and secured with ropes strong enough to check the violent recoil when it fired. The guns had to be arranged along the deck so that they could be worked, with room for their crews to serve them, space to run them in and out, and the tackle to control them. All of this weight, the bronze of the guns and the oak of their carriages and the shot and powder that fed them, added to the burden the ship carried, and much of it, being on the gun decks, was carried high, contributing its share to the fatal imbalance. There is a grim symmetry in the fact that the very guns that made her formidable also helped to sink her. that the concentration of heavy metal high in the ship, which was her pride, was also, in the plain physics of the matter, part of what rolled her over. The purpose of all this firepower was, of course, war, and specifically the kind of war that a ship of the line was built to wage. The great artillery duels in which fleets battered one another with their broadsides until one side was crippled or fled. A broadside from the ship, all the guns of one side firing together or in close sequence, would send across the water a weight of iron capable of doing terrible damage, and the ship that could deliver the heaviest broadside and endure the enemies in return held a great advantage. The two decks of the great ship meant that her broadside would be heavier than that of most vessels she might meet, and this was the whole point of the design, the reason the second deck of guns had been thought worth the risk it carried. In the calculations of naval power, such a ship was a mighty asset, able to dominate a battle line and to stiffen a whole fleet by her presence. Whether she would ever fire those broadsides in earnest depended, of course, on her first being able to sail, and that was the question that all her firepower could not answer, the question that lay quietly waiting beneath all the magnificence. But the guns were not only weapons, they too were part of the ship's great statement, part of the message she was built to deliver. A ship bristling with so many heavy bronze cannon, ranged in their double rows along her sides, was an intimidating sight, and it was meant to be. When such a ship lay at anchor where friends and enemies could see her, or sailed into a foreign port, the sheer visible weight of her armament spoke as loudly as her carvings of the power and the wealth and the resolve of the crown that had built her. Guns were expensive, and many heavy guns were very expensive, and a state that could arm a ship so lavishly was announcing, in the most concrete possible terms, that it had the resources and the will to make itself feared. In an age when the appearance of strength was itself a kind of strength, when reputation could win advantages that need never be tested in battle, a ship like this was worth having as much for the impression she made as for the fighting she might do. She was meant to be spoken of, to be reported by ambassadors and travellers, to lodge in the minds of rival princes as a reason to think twice before crossing the northern kingdom. And in this at least she succeeded beyond anyone's intention, though not at all in the way that was hoped, for she would indeed be spoken of, and remembered, and lodged forever in the minds of those who heard her story, but as a byword for disaster rather than for might. As the ship neared completion then, she gathered into herself an extraordinary concentration of value and effort and hope. The labour of hundreds of men over years, the timber of 1,000 oaks, the treasure of her bronze guns, the artistry of her carvers and painters, and the ambition of a king and a kingdom reaching for greatness on the water. Everything about her was designed to overwhelm, to impress, to dominate, and by any measure of appearance she achieved it. She was, in the last weeks before her voyage, one of the most powerful and most beautiful ships that had ever floated on the Northern Sea, and everyone who saw her must have felt that here was something truly remarkable, a vessel worthy of the great king who had willed her into being, and yet, for all of that, for all the guns and the gold and the towering carved stern, the one thing she most needed, the one thing without which all the rest was worthless, was the humble and unglamorous quality of stability, the plain ability to stand upright under sail, and this was the very thing she lacked. All her magnificence rested on a hull too narrow and too shallow to bear it safely, and the men responsible for sending her to sea were about to receive, in the clearest possible terms, a warning of exactly that, in a simple test carried out at her moorings only a little while before she sailed. It is to that warning, and to the fateful decision to ignore it, that we must now turn. Some time before she was to sail, while she lay at her moorings in the harbour of the capital, the great ship was given a test, and the test told the truth about her, plainly enough for anyone with the courage to hear it. The trial was a simple one, of a kind sometimes used in that age to judge whether a ship was steady, and it needed no instruments and no calculations, only a number of men and a stretch of deck. A group of the crew, some 30 of them, were set to run together from one side of the ship to the other and back again, all at once, so that their shifting weight would rock the vessel and show how she answered to it. A steady, well-found ship would roll a little under such treatment, and then settle back upright, unbothered, her low weight bringing her back to her feet. A dangerously tender ship would lean far and return slowly and reluctantly, showing by her sluggishness and the depth of her lean that she had too little to right her and too much to tip her. So the men ran, all together across the deck and back, and the ship rolled, and then they ran again, and she rolled further and a third time, and by now she was heeling over so alarmingly, leaning so far and recovering so poorly that those in charge stopped the test for fear that if the men made a fourth run she would roll right over there at her moorings in the calm water of the harbour with no wind and no sail upon her at all. 3 runs of 30 men had very nearly capsized her at anchor. It is difficult to imagine a clearer warning or a more damning one. The test was witnessed by men who understood its meaning, among them a high officer of the fleet, an admiral of standing and experience, who stood on the deck and watched the great ship lean and stagger under so slight a provocation. There survives, in the accounts of these events, the memory of his reaction, of words to the effect that he only wished the master builder had still been alive and present to see it, a remark that carried within it, beneath its restraint, a whole world of alarm and reproach. For here was the pride of the fleet, the most expensive and magnificent ship in the kingdom, showing before witnesses that she could barely stand upright at her moorings, and here was the man who might best have judged what to do about it, long since dead, his knowledge gone with him, the ship left in the hands of those who had inherited a problem they could not now solve. The admiral understood what he had seen. Everyone of experience who stood on that deck must have understood it, and yet the test was stopped, and its terrible lesson was, in effect, set aside, and the great ship was allowed to go forward to her sailing all the same. Why? The answer lies in the fearful pressure of the whole situation, and in the very human difficulty of calling a halt to something so large and so far advanced, at such cost, with such expectations riding upon it. The king was away at his wars, far off across the sea, and he had been sending letters home, impatient for his great ship, wanting her ready and at sea, expecting her to be the jewel of his fleet in the campaign he was waging. To hold her back now, to declare that the pride of the navy was unfit to sail and must be rebuilt or ballasted anew or in some way delayed, was to take upon oneself an enormous responsibility, to disappoint the king, to admit that vast sums had been spent on a vessel that could not safely go to sea, to become the person who had halted the great enterprise. Against that stood only the evidence of the test, alarming certainly, but perhaps, a hopeful mind might argue, not conclusive. Perhaps she would sit more steadily once more fully laden, once her stores and her guns were all aboard and settled, once she was properly trimmed. Perhaps the trouble, though real, could be managed. It is easy, from the safe distance of centuries, to see that the test should have been decisive, that the ship should never have been allowed to sail as she was. It was far harder in the moment for men caught in the machinery of a great state project, with a distant king's displeasure to fear and a nearly finished ship before them, to be the one who said no, and so no one in the end said it, or no one who said it was heeded, and the fatal decision was made not by any single villain, but by the whole weight of circumstance, by pressure and hope, and the reluctance to face an unbearable truth. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the men most immediately caught in this, above all on the captain who would command her on her voyage, for his position was a cruel one. He of all people had reason to know she was tender, for he was there, and would have felt her behaviour, and would have known of the test and its result. And yet he was a naval officer under orders, expected to take his ship to sea, with the whole apparatus of the state and the expectation of an absent king pressing upon him. What was such a man to do? To refuse to sail was to court ruin and disgrace. To sail was to trust that somehow it would be all right, that the ship would hold, that the danger, though real, would not be realised on this particular calm day in this particular sheltered water. He chose, as very many people in his position across history have chosen, to go forward, to trust and to hope, to do what was expected of him, and to pray that the worst would not happen. It is not hard to feel for him. He was not reckless, and he was not a fool. He was a man given an impossible position by decisions made above and before him, by a flaw built into the ship years earlier, and by a chain of pressures that left him little real freedom. When the ship went down and the inquest came, much of its attention would fall on him, and he would have to answer for a disaster whose roots lay far deeper than any choice of his. There is a hard lesson in that, about how the people at the sharp end of a failure are so often not the ones truly responsible for it, and about how a fault built quietly into the foundations of a thing can wait years to declare itself, and then fall upon whoever happens to be standing there when it does. So the warning was given, as plainly as any warning could be, and it was not heeded, and the great ship was made ready for her voyage, with the knowledge of her tenderness locked, one imagines, uneasily in the minds of those who had seen the test and understood it. Perhaps they told themselves it would be all right. Perhaps they truly hoped so. Perhaps they simply could not see any way to stop the vast machinery that was carrying the ship toward the sea. Whatever passed through their minds, the days went by. The final preparations were made, the guns and the stores were brought aboard, the crew was mustered, and the ship lay at her moorings in all her painted and gilded glory, waiting for the day appointed for her to spread her sails at last and carry the might of the Northern Kingdom out onto the water. The day, when it came, was fine and bright, a fair day of late summer with a gentle wind, the kind of day on which nothing could seem less likely than disaster, and the whole city turned out to watch. It was the 10th day of August, in the year 1628, and it would be remembered for as long as ships and the sea are remembered, though not for any of the reasons that the crowds gathering along the shore that morning would have imagined. The capital that morning was a city expectant, gathered along its waterfronts to see the great ship go. For years she had been building in their midst, a growing presence on the harbour, and everyone knew what she was and what she was meant to be. The mightiest and most beautiful vessel the kingdom had ever made, the pride of the crown, the wonder of the north. Now at last she was to sail, and a maiden voyage of such a ship was an event that drew a whole city out of doors. People crowded the quays and the shores, gathered at every point from which the harbour could be seen, stood at their windows and climbed to their rooftops, come to witness the great moment and to share in the pride of it. There would have been a holiday feeling in the air, a mingling of curiosity and celebration, the ordinary business of the day set aside for the spectacle of the ship. Foreign visitors and diplomats were said to be present, for such an occasion was watched by more than the townsfolk. The sailing of the great ship was a matter of state, a thing that other courts would hear of, and its beginning was meant to be witnessed and reported and admired. The stage, in other words, was as public as could be, the audience as large, the expectation as high, and all of it was about to become the setting, not for a triumph, but for a catastrophe played out before every eye. Aboard the ship, the final preparations for departure went forward. The crew were at their stations, the officers commanding, the great vessel alive with the ordered bustle of a ship about to sail. And aboard her too, by the custom of such occasions, were the others, the wives and children and guests who had been permitted to come along for the first part of the voyage, to share in the celebration before being set ashore further down the harbour. One can imagine the mood among them, the excitement of standing on the deck of the famous ship, of feeling beneath their feet the vessel they had watched a building for so long, of being part, however briefly, of so grand an event. They had come to celebrate, not to sail into danger, and there was no reason in the world on that fine bright morning for any of them to feel the least unease. The ship was magnificent, the day was fair, the wind was light, and the whole affair had the air of a festival. That so ordinary and joyful a scene should stand on the very edge of horror is one of the hardest things about the story to sit with, and yet it is essential to it, for the disaster's whole meaning is bound up in the innocence of the moment before, in the crowds smiling on the shore and the families proud upon the deck, none of them knowing what the next few minutes held. The ship lay in a sheltered position, in the lee of the high ground of the city, where the wind that morning would have been light and fitful, blocked and broken by the land, so that as she began to move she felt only gentle airs. This too would prove part of the tragedy, in a way, for in that sheltered start there was nothing to reveal her weakness, no strong steady wind to test her before she was committed. She was warped out from her moorings, worked out into the channel by ropes and boats, and then, as she gained a little sea room, the order was given to make sail, and her people went aloft and loosed her canvas, and the sails were sheeted home and began to fill. Not all of her sail was set at first, only a part of it, a modest spread of canvas suited to the gentle beginning of the voyage, and this too matters, for it means she was not driven hard, not pressed by a great weight of sail. She was moving gently under a fraction of her power on a light and pleasant day. If even that was too much for her, then her weakness was grave indeed. She fired her guns in salute as she got under way, a courtesy of the occasion, the great cannon of one side sounding out across the water to mark the sailing of the ship, and for this the lower gun ports were opened, the ports run up and the guns run out to fire, and then, fatefully, the ports were left open, as was natural in the moment, with the guns run out and the salute being made and the ship apparently doing nothing but gliding gently down the harbour under an easy sail. Here we must pause and hold the scene, for everything that follows turns upon these few details, and it is worth being exact about them, and equally worth being honest about the limits of what can be known. The ship was moving slowly out of the sheltered water toward the more open harbour. She was under only part of her sail. The day was fine and the general wind was light, and her lower gun port stood open, close above the water, after the firing of her salute. Into this situation she now sailed, out from behind the shelter of the high land toward the place where the wind, no longer blocked by the city, could reach her more freely. She'd gone only a short way, a distance that can be measured in a few hundreds of paces, a stretch of water you could take in at a glance, when she came out from the lee of the land and met the wind of the open harbour, and that wind, though still no great gale, was enough. What exactly the wind did in that moment, whether it came as a single gust or two, how strong it truly was, these are things the surviving accounts describe in their several ways, and which cannot now be fixed with perfect certainty, and it is more honest to say that a freshening of the wind caught her than to pretend to a precision the record does not hold. But of the essential thing there is no doubt at all. The wind reached her sails, pressed upon them, and began to lean her over, and this time, unlike in the sheltered water, there was no land to shield her, and no easy recovery. For the flaw built into her years before now met the force that would reveal it, and the great ship began to heel. She leaned, and the crew fought to save her, casting off the sheets to spill the wind from the sails, doing what seamen do when a ship heels too far, trying to relieve the pressure and let her come back upright. And for a moment perhaps she seemed to answer, to lean and then to hesitate, as she had leaned and hesitated at her moorings under the running men. But the wind pressed again, or pressed still, and this time she went past the point from which she could return. She heeled further, and as she heeled, the open lower gun ports, close above the water on the side she was leaning toward, dipped down toward the surface, and the moment came, swift and irreversible, when the lower edge of those open ports met the water and the sea began to pour in. That was the end, though the end would take a few minutes more to complete itself. Once the water began to enter through the open ports, it ran into the ship in a flood, and its weight, low in the hull and all on the side she was already leaning toward, dragged her further over still, which lowered the port still more, which let in still more water, in a swift and merciless spiral from which there was no escaping. The pride of the fleet, the wonder of the north, the ship of 10,000 hopes and 1,000 oaks, and a treasure of bronze guns, having sailed for a few short minutes on a fine calm afternoon, before the eyes of a whole watching city, leaned over, filled, and began to sink. What followed, in those few minutes, was quiet and terrible, and it unfolded before more witnesses than almost any disaster of its age, for the whole city was watching. As the water poured in through the open ports and the ship heeled further and further, all the ordered life of the vessel dissolved into chaos and struggle. The deck, which a moment before had been a place of celebration and pride, tilted beneath everyone's feet, steeper and steeper, until standing became impossible, and men and women and children began to slide and fall toward the low side, toward the rising water. Everything not fastened down went with them. The loose gear of the ship, the guns straining at their ropes on the canting decks, the whole world tipping over into the sea. For those on the upper deck and in the open there was at least the sky above them, and the chance, for some, of scrambling clear, of clinging to the high side, of leaping into the water and being pulled from it. For those caught below, on the gun decks and deeper in the ship, the situation was far more dreadful. For as the ship rolled and the water flooded in, the way out grew harder and then impossible, and many were trapped in the darkening, flooding interior with no path to the light. The ship did not vanish in an instant. She settled and rolled over the space of minutes, and in those minutes there was time for terror, time for struggle, time for some to save themselves and others to be lost, all of it visible, in its outward form at least, to the horrified crowds on the shore. Boats put out at once from the surrounding water, from the shore and from other vessels in the harbour, rowing hard toward the sinking ship to pluck people from the sea, and many were saved this way, drawn dripping and shocked from the water and carried to safety. The harbour was full of craft and full of people, and the ship went down close to land, in the very throat of the city, so that help was near and swift, and this nearness surely saved lives that would have been lost had she foundered far out at sea. But help could not reach those trapped within the hull, and it could not undo the swiftness of the thing, and when the ship at last went fully over and down, settling to the bottom in the deep water of the harbour with her masts for a time still standing above the surface, A number of those who had sailed on her did not come back. How many died is one of the things that cannot be stated with certainty, for no exact and reliable count was made or has survived, and estimates have varied. The number is usually reckoned in the tens, something on the order of 30 souls, though some accounts suggest it may have been more, and the truth is that we do not precisely know. What is certain is that people died, ordinary people and sailors alike, among them, in all likelihood, some of those wives and children and guests who had come aboard only to celebrate, and that they died within sight of their own city, in its sheltered water, on a calm and sunny afternoon, in the wreck of the ship that was to have been the kingdom's glory. There is a particular quality to a disaster witnessed by a crowd, and it is worth dwelling on, for it shaped how the loss of the ship was felt and remembered. This was not a ship lost far away in a distant storm, her fate learned of only later through rumour and report. This was a catastrophe enacted in full public view, in the heart of the capital, before thousands of eyes in bright daylight. The people who had gathered to cheer became, in the space of a few minutes, the appalled witnesses of a tragedy, watching helplessly as the great ship they had come to admire leaned and filled and rolled and sank, hearing, perhaps, the cries from the water, seeing the boats dashing out, seeing the masts of the wonderful vessel standing forlorn above the surface, where a moment before she had been gliding in her glory. The shock of it must have been immense and immediate, and shared by a whole city at once. And beyond the human grief there was the sheer scale of the loss to the crown, the vast wealth of the ship, the years of labour, the treasure of her guns, the pride and the ambition, all of it gone to the bottom in minutes, in the shallowest and safest of waters, without an enemy in sight, without a storm, without any of the usual causes of a ship's destruction. She had not been sunk by battle or by tempest, or by any of the sea's ordinary violences. She had simply fallen over and sunk, undone by her own making in front of everyone, and that was a kind of humiliation as much as a grief, a public unmasking of a great and costly failure. When the great ship had settled to the bottom, and the water had grown quiet again over the place where she lay, the harbour that had been so full of celebration was full instead of grief and confusion, and the urgent work of rescue and recovery. The survivors were brought ashore, the shocked, and the injured, and the bereaved. The dead who could be recovered were recovered, others remained within the ship or were lost in the water, and the great vessel herself lay below, on the bottom of the harbour, her hull settled in the mud, her upper masts for a while, still reaching above the surface as a mute and terrible marker of where she had gone down, until in time even these were dealt with, cut away or fallen, and the surface of the water closed over the whole enormous fact of her, leaving only the memory and the shame and the questions. For there were questions at once, urgent and angry ones. How could this have happened? How could the pride of the fleet, the ship on which so much had been spent and so much had depended, have sunk in the harbour on her first afternoon, in calm weather, without an enemy near? Who was to blame? These questions would occupy the authorities in the days and weeks that followed, and an inquest would be held to try to answer them, though the answers it reached would be, in their way, as revealing of the difficulty of the whole affair as the disaster itself. But before we come to the inquest, it is worth simply resting for a moment in the enormity of what had happened, in the strange, sad, quiet fact of it. A ship built to carry a kingdom's power across the sea, armed with a treasure of guns, clothed in the art of a whole age, freighted with the hopes of a king, had sailed for a few minutes on a fine day, and then lain down in the water and died, taking a number of her people with her, in front of a whole city. There is something almost dreamlike in the swiftness and the completeness of it, in the way the greatest of ambitions met the plainest of ends, in the way all that magnificence came, in the space of a few hundred paces of gentle sailing, to rest upon the muddy floor of the harbour, and there she would stay for a very long time, longer than anyone that day could possibly have imagined, while the world above the water changed beyond all recognition. The city would grow and change, the kingdom would rise to its brief height of greatness and then decline, the very memory of the ship would fade until she was little more than a name in old records and a vague tradition of a wreck somewhere in the harbour. Generations would live and die who had never heard of her, and all that time she would lie there in the cold and the dark, held safe by the very water that had drowned her, waiting, though no one knew she was waiting, for the distant day when she would be sought again and found and raised into a world utterly unlike the one that had built her and lost her. The loss of so great and costly a ship, in so public and so inexplicable a manner, could not be allowed to pass without inquiry. And in the days after the disaster, the authorities of the kingdom set about trying to understand what had happened and who, if anyone, was to blame. An inquest was convened, the captain and officers and others were summoned and questioned, and the whole painful business of assigning responsibility for a catastrophe began, as such businesses always do, with the search for someone who could be held to account. The captain who'd commanded her was closely examined, for suspicion naturally fell first upon the man in charge at the moment of the disaster. Had he been drunk? Had the crew been at fault? Had the guns been improperly secured so that they shifted and unbalanced her? Had some error of seamanship, some careless handling of the ship been the cause? These were the sorts of questions that an inquest of that age would ask, seeking a human fault, a moment of negligence or misconduct that could explain the loss and be punished. And the captain, for his part, defended himself and his crew, insisting, as far as the record allows us to judge, that the guns had been properly secured, that the ship had been handled correctly, that the fault lay not in the sailing of her but in the ship herself, in her very construction, in the way she had been built and ballasted. He pointed in effect at the deeper truth that no fault of seamanship had sunk her, that she had been unsound from the start, and here the inquest ran up against the hard and awkward reality that made a clean verdict impossible. For if the ship had been sunk not by any error on the day, but by a flaw built into her during her construction, then the blame lay with those who had designed and built her, and this opened a door that no one in the end was eager to walk through. The master shipwright who had begun her was dead, beyond any reckoning of the earthly courts, and much of the responsibility for her proportions had died with him. The men who had completed her had worked to a design and to intentions largely set by others, under pressure and to shifting demands, and behind all of them, at the very top, stood the crown itself, the king who had wanted the great ship, who had pressed for her, who had, by some accounts, had a hand in the very decisions about her size and her armament that had made her so top-heavy and so doomed. To pursue the question of blame to its root was to risk arriving at the throne, and that was a place the inquest could not go. It could hardly find the king at fault for the loss of the king's own ship, and so the inquiry, having examined and questioned and deliberated, arrived in the end at no clear culprit, punished no one, and let the matter rest. The ship had been badly built, too narrow and too unstable for all she carried. That much was acknowledged, but the fault could not be safely laid at any living and punishable door, and so, in effect, it was laid at no door at all. The disaster was, officially, a misfortune without a guilty party, a great and costly accident for which no one would answer. There is something both frustrating and deeply human in that outcome, and it is worth reflecting on, for it is a pattern that recurs across the long history of great failures. The people most immediately present at the disaster, the captain and crew, were not truly the cause of it. The cause lay in decisions made years before and far above them, in a flaw designed into the ship by a process that involved many hands and much pressure and a king's ambition. But those responsible were beyond reach, dead or too exalted to be blamed, and so the fault dissolved into the general fog of circumstance and no one was held to account. It was not that the truth was unknown. The essential truth that the ship was unsound in her construction seems to have been understood well enough. It was that the truth pointed in directions where blame could not usefully or safely be assigned, and so it was allowed to remain, as it were, ownerless. The great ship had been destroyed by the very ambition that made her magnificent, by the reaching for more than the craft of the age could safely deliver, and no single person could be made to carry the weight of that. It was a collective failure, a failure of the whole enterprise, and such failures rarely find a tidy villain to punish. The sea had rendered its verdict on the ship's construction with brutal clarity. The courts of men could only shuffle uneasily around the edges of that verdict and in the end fall silent. If the question of blame proved impossible to resolve, the question of the ship's guns proved much more tractable, and it was to this that a great deal of energy was soon directed, for the bronze cannon lying with the wreck represented a fortune too great to abandon. In the years and decades that followed the sinking, efforts were made to recover the valuable guns from the ship on the bottom of the harbour, and though the wreck lay in water deep enough to defeat the simple methods of the time, human ingenuity eventually found a way. Some decades after the disaster, salvagers using a diving bell managed to reach the wreck and recover most of the precious bronze guns, hauling them up one by one from the deep. The diving bell was a remarkable device for its age, a heavy bell-shaped chamber lowered to the bottom with a pocket of air trapped inside it, within which a diver could descend and work for short periods before rising to breathe, reaching down into the cold dark water to attach lines to the guns so that they could be raised. Working in near total darkness at a depth that would have been dangerous and exhausting, these salvagers succeeded in bringing up the great majority of the ship's cannon, an extraordinary feat of early diving that stripped from the wreck the most valuable thing she carried. It is worth pausing to admire the courage and skill of those men, descending into the black water in their primitive bell to grapple with the guns of the dead ship, and to note that this early salvage, remarkable as it was, also disturbed the wreck and removed from her much of what had made her worth plundering, so that once the guns were gone there was little reason for anyone to trouble her further. And so, after the guns had been recovered, the great ship was left largely alone, and the world began slowly to forget her. The immediate shock and grief and scandal of her loss faded, as such things do, into memory, and then into history, and then into something dimmer still. The place where she lay was known, in a general way, to some, but as the years became decades and the decades became centuries, even that knowledge grew vague and uncertain, until the exact spot where the pride of the fleet had gone down was no longer clearly remembered. The ship passed out of a living memory, out of common knowledge, into the obscurity of old records and half-forgotten tradition. Above her, the harbour went on with its endless traffic, ships coming and going over the very spot where she lay, the water closing over her story as it had closed over her hull. She'd become in effect invisible, a great secret lying in the mud beneath the busy surface of the harbour, waiting through the long centuries in the cold and the dark. And it was precisely there, in that long dark waiting, in the very conditions of her burial, that the strangest and most fortunate part of her whole strange story was quietly unfolding. For the water that had drowned her was, in its own way, preserving her, keeping her safe and nearly whole through all the years against the distant day when she would be sought and found again. The story of the great Swedish ship, for all its singularity, belongs to a much longer story, the long human contest to build ships ever greater, and it is worth setting her for a while against that wider background, for she was neither the first nor the last vessel to be undone by ambition outrunning craft, nor the only one to carry a kingdom's pride upon the water. Across the centuries, wherever there have been rich and powerful states with access to the sea, there have been rulers who wish to build the greatest ship of their age, and the reasons have always been much the same: the mingling of genuine need with pure prestige, the desire for a vessel that would be at once a weapon and a wonder and a statement. Long before the age of the great sailing warships, in the ancient world, kings and cities had built enormous vessels more remarkable for their size and splendour than for any practical use, ships so large that they strained the very possibility of moving them, built to awe rather than to serve. The impulse is very old, this reaching for the largest possible ship as a proof of greatness, and it has recurred in every age that had the wealth and the will to indulge it, and it has again and again run up against the same stubborn limits, the limits of wood and water and the craft of the builders. Among the ships that make the most instructive companions to the Swedish disaster, there is one in particular that offers an almost uncanny parallel. An English warship lost the better part of a century earlier, in the reign of a famous king, which sank in home waters in the sight of her sovereign under circumstances strikingly similar. She too was a great ship of her age, a prestigious vessel of the royal fleet, and she too went down not far from shore, heeling over as water entered through her open lower gun ports, with heavy loss of life among those aboard. The precise cause of her loss has been debated ever since, whether it was a fault in her handling, an overloading, a sudden gust taking her as she turned, or some combination of these, and the debate has never been finally settled, so that she remains, like the Swedish ship, a case in which the exact sequence of the disaster is argued over rather than known for certain. And, most remarkably of all, she shared with the Swedish ship the strange second life of being raised, centuries later, from the bed of the sea and preserved for the modern world to study and to wonder at, so that the two of them stand now as the great twin survivors of their vanished ages of shipbuilding, each recovered from the water that had held her for hundreds of years, each teaching us more about the ships and the seafaring of her time than any document could. The two such ships, lost in such similar ways in such distant centuries, should both have been recovered and preserved, is one of the quiet marvels of the whole subject, a double gift from the sea to those who came long after. Not all the great ships of the age ended in disaster, of course, and it is only fair to set beside the failures, the successes, the mighty vessels that were built with equal ambition and equal splendour and yet proved sound, sailing long and useful careers and serving as the pride of their fleets for decades. In the years after the Swedish ship went down, another kingdom built a warship of surpassing magnificence, larger and even more lavishly ornamented, gilded so richly that her enemies gave her a nickname that spoke of gold and of the devil together, so dazzling and so formidable did she appear. But this ship, unlike the Swedish one, was soundly built, and she did not fall over on her first afternoon. She sailed and fought and endured for many years, was rebuilt and continued in service, and lived out a long career worthy of her splendour before she was at last destroyed, not by any flaw in her building but by an accidental fire long afterward. The contrast between the two ships is instructive. Both were built as supreme expressions of royal power and ambition. Both were floating works of art bristling with guns and crowded with carvings. Both were among the most magnificent vessels of their time, but one was proportioned soundly, within the limits of what the craft could safely bear, and one was not. And that difference, invisible perhaps to the admiring eye, made all the difference in the world. The difference between a long and glorious career and a catastrophe in the harbour on the very first day. That, in the end, is perhaps the deepest lesson that the great Swedish ship offers when she is set against her rivals and companions across the centuries, the lesson that magnificence and soundness are not the same thing, and that the eye cannot tell them apart. She looked every inch a great ship, indeed the greatest of her age, and by every measure of appearance she was one. Her guns, her carvings, her towering stern, her sheer size, all proclaimed her the equal or the superior of anything afloat. And yet beneath that magnificent surface lay a fatal flaw invisible to admiration, a want of the plain, unglamorous quality of stability, and that hidden fault undid all the visible glory in a matter of minutes. The ships that succeeded and the ships that failed often looked much alike. The difference lay in things that did not show, in proportions and balances that the craft of the age could barely judge and could not calculate, in the quiet arithmetic of weight and water that no amount of gilding could alter. The Swedish ship is the supreme example of the gap between appearance and reality in the building of great things, the ship that had everything except the one thing that mattered most, and in that she stands as a kind of parable, applicable far beyond the world of ships, about the danger of mistaking splendour for soundness, and about how the most impressive-looking enterprises can harbour, unseen, the very flaws that will destroy them. There is a further reflection to be drawn from setting her among the great ships of history, and it is a gentler one, about the long persistence of human ambition despite its many failures. For all the disasters, for all the ships that sank and the fortunes that were lost and the lives that were spent, the reaching for greater and grander vessels never stopped. Each age, learning something from the failures of the last, built again, larger and bolder, pushing once more against the limits, and sometimes overreaching and sometimes succeeding, and the great line of ever more ambitious ships stretches unbroken from the giants of the ancient world through the great sailing warships and onto the vast vessels of later centuries. There is something in the human spirit that will always reach for the largest and most magnificent thing it can imagine, that will pour wealth and labour and genius into the building of it, that will risk failure and disaster for the sake of the wonder and the pride, and that will build again after every failure, undeterred. The Swedish ship is one moment in that long-reaching, a moment of failure certainly, but also a moment of extraordinary ambition and artistry and hope, and she takes her place in the great procession of vessels by which humankind has tried, across the ages, to master the water and to proclaim its glory upon it. And she takes too a place quite her own, for of all that great procession, she is among the very few that we can still see and touch, raised from the deep to stand before us, and it is to the long story of how that came to pass, of her centuries of waiting and her strange return, that we now come at last. The centuries that the great ship spent on the floor of the harbour were, in their quiet way, the most extraordinary part of her existence, for during all that long darkness she was being preserved by an almost miraculous conjunction of circumstances, kept whole and safe through the passing of one age into another, so that she might rise at last into a world that had entirely forgotten her. To understand this, we must understand something about the sea in which she lay, for it was the peculiar nature of that sea that saved her and that made her survival possible, where in almost any other water she would long since have vanished. The waters of the northern harbour where she sank are not the fully salt waters of the open ocean. They are brackish, a mixture of the salt sea and the vast inflow of fresh water from the rivers and the land, so that the sea there is far less salty than the great oceans of the world. This is a matter that would seem, at first, to have nothing to do with the fate of a sunken ship, and yet it made all the difference, for it determined whether or not she would be devoured. In the salt seas of the world there lives a small creature, a kind of burrowing mollusk that is the great destroyer of wooden ships and sunken timber, for it bores into submerged wood and eats it away from within, riddling it with tunnels until the strongest oak is reduced to a fragile honeycomb that crumbles to nothing. This creature has been the ruin of countless wooden hulls and sunken wrecks across the ages, so that in the warm salt seas a wooden ship on the bottom may be largely consumed within a matter of years or decades, its timbers eaten away until little remains but the objects of stone and metal and pottery that the wood borers cannot touch. But this creature cannot live in water that is too little salt, and the brackish water of the northern harbour was too fresh for it, so that in that particular sea the great destroyer of ships was absent, and the timbers of the sunken vessel lay safe from the boring and eating that would have consumed them anywhere else. The very coldness of the water helped too, slowing the processes of decay, and the soft mud of the harbour floor into which much of the hull settled sealed away parts of the ship from the water and the little life it did contain, protecting them further. It was as though the ship had been laid by chance, in almost the only kind of grave in which she could have been so perfectly kept, a cold, dark, brackish, muddy resting place where the ordinary ruin of sunken things did not come, and where she could wait, whole and patient, through the centuries. And wait she did, while the world above her changed beyond all recognition. The kingdom that had built her rose, in the years just after her loss, to the very height of its power, becoming for a brief and dazzling span one of the great powers of Europe, its armies marching far across the continent, its dominion spread wide around the northern sea. And then, as all such heights are, it was past, and the kingdom declined from its greatness, its power ebbing, its dominions shrinking, until it settled into the quieter and more modest place it holds today. Through all of this the ship lay on the bottom of the harbour, indifferent to the fortunes of the crown she had been built to serve, neither rising with its greatness nor falling with its decline, simply enduring in the dark. The centuries passed over her. The manner of building ships changed utterly, wood giving way in time to iron and steel, sail to steam, the whole world of seafaring that she had belonged to fading into history. The city above her grew and transformed, generation after generation living out their lives along the waterfront, ships without number passing over the very place where she lay, and almost none of them sparing a thought for the great vessel in the mud beneath, for almost none of them knew she was there. For she had been forgotten, and this forgetting was itself a slow process spread across the long years. In the first decades after her loss she was remembered well enough, a recent scandal and grief, her guns salvaged, her story known. But memory fades, and as the people who had witnessed the disaster died, and their children after them, the ship passed out of living memory into the dimmer realm of record and tradition. She survived as a name in old documents, as a story that might be told, as a vague knowledge that somewhere in the harbour lay the wreck of a great ship lost long ago. But the exact place of her, the precise spot where she rested, grew uncertain and then was lost, so that even those who knew of her in a general way could not have said just where she was. She became a kind of legend, half real and half faded, a ship that had once existed and once been lost and now lay somewhere below, no one quite knew where, in the mud of the busy harbour. The traffic of the port passed over her unknowing. The modern city took shape around her hiding place, and the great ship, whole and waiting in her cold dark grave, kept her long silence, preserved by the brackish water and the soft mud, holding within her sunken hull the perfect record of a vanished age, her carvings and her timbers, and the very tools and belongings of her crew all kept safe in the dark, against a day of finding that no one could foresee. It is worth dwelling, before we come to that finding, on the strange patience of the situation, on the thought of the ship lying there through all those years, so near to the surface and the life of the city, and yet so utterly hidden so completely present and so completely forgotten. Beneath the keels of passing ships, beneath the reflections of a growing city, beneath the ordinary daylight of century after century, she lay in the dark, whole, waiting, a magnificent secret in the mud. All the life that had been in her, the men who had built her and sailed her and died in her was long gone. The world that had made her was long changed. And still she remained, a great physical fact persisting through time, holding her shape and her carvings and her cargo of history in the cold preserving water. There is something almost tender in the thought of it. The ship kept so carefully by the very sea that had killed her, held in trust through the long centuries until a distant generation should come, curious and patient to seek her out. She did not know she was waiting, of course. She was only wood and iron and stone in the dark. But we, knowing how the story ends, cannot help but feel that she was waiting, that all those centuries of darkness were a kind of long-held breath, and that the moment was coming, though it was still a long way off, when the breath would be released, when the patient searcher would find her at last, and when the great ship, drowned on her first afternoon and forgotten for 300 years, would begin incredibly to rise. The man who found her again was not a treasure hunter nor an official of any great institution, but a patient and determined enthusiast, an engineer with a deep love of the history of the sea, and a particular fascination with the old ships that lay lost in the northern waters. He had come to understand the remarkable fact that made these waters special, that in their cold, brackish embrace, wooden ships might survive where elsewhere they would have been eaten away, and he reasoned that somewhere in the harbour of the capital there might still lie, whole or nearly so, the great ship that the old record said had sunk there on her maiden voyage 3 centuries before. Where others might have dismissed the idea as hopeless, the ship long since decayed or buried past finding, he understood that the very conditions of that sea gave real hope that she might still be there, substantially intact, waiting. And so he set himself to find her, and he went about it with the patience that the task demanded, studying the old documents and accounts, trying to work out from the scattered and imprecise records where exactly the ship had gone down, narrowing the search, and then going out onto the water to look. He looked for a long time, over a stretch of years, sweeping and sampling the harbour bottom in the area where he believed she must lie, enduring failure after failure, dragging up mud and rubbish and the ordinary detritus of a busy harbour, and finding nothing of the great ship. It was slow, unglamorous, discouraging work, the work of a man pursuing a conviction that most would have thought foolish, and he persisted in it with a quiet stubbornness that is, in its way, as admirable as any feat of the ship's original building. And then, at last, his patience was rewarded. Using a device that could bring up a small core sample from the harbour bottom, a tool that would pull up a plug of whatever lay below, he brought to the surface, from a particular spot in the harbour, a piece of old black waterlogged oak, dark and ancient and unmistakably from some old wooden structure buried in the mud. It was the sign he had sought for so long, the first solid proof that something great and old lay below at that place, and further investigation confirmed it. There, in the mud of the harbour, in the spot he had at last identified, lay the wreck of a great wooden ship, substantially whole, the very vessel he had believed in and searched for. After 3 centuries of darkness and forgetting, the great ship had been found. It is difficult to imagine the feeling of that discovery, the moment when the dark old oak came up on the sampler and the long search resolved into certainty, when a conviction held against all discouragement was suddenly and gloriously vindicated. The ship that had been lost for 300 years, forgotten by almost everyone, her very place uncertain, was there after all exactly as the patient searcher had believed, waiting in the mud to be found. Finding her, however, was only the beginning, for to find a great ship whole on the bottom of a harbour is one thing, and to raise her intact into the air is quite another, and the raising of the ship would prove one of the most delicate and difficult salvage operations ever attempted. The vessel had lain for 3 centuries in the mud. Her timbers, though preserved, were soft and fragile with their long soaking, no longer possessed of the strength of sound, seasoned oak, and she was enormous, a huge and heavy structure that could not simply be hooked and hauled up without tearing herself apart. A way had to be found to lift so great and so fragile a mass from the deep without destroying it, and the solution that was devised was as ingenious as it was laborious. Divers descended to the wreck and, working in the cold and the dark and the mud at the bottom of the harbour, set about the extraordinary task of digging tunnels beneath the hull of the ship, tunnels through the mud under the great vessel, through which massive cables could be passed, so that the ship might be cradled in a sling of cables and lifted from below rather than torn at from above. It was slow, dangerous, exhausting work, carried out largely by feel in the near-total blackness of the harbour bottom, the divers burrowing beneath the enormous hull that hung above them, threading their cables through, and it demanded great courage and skill. But it was accomplished, and with the ship cradled in her sling of cables, the long process of lifting her could begin. She was not raised all at once, in a single dramatic heave, but gradually and carefully, in stages, lifted a little, and moved into shallower water, then lifted again, over a period of preparation and effort, while all the while the work went on to make her ready to bear the final rise into the air. And then, on a day in the spring, in the year 1961, more than 3 centuries after she had sunk, the great ship broke the surface of the harbour at last, her long-drowned timbers rising into the daylight for the first time since that August afternoon so long before. It must have been an astonishing sight. The dark and dripping hull of the ancient vessel emerging from the water, the great ship that had been lost for 300 years rising again into the world, streaming mud and water, blackened by her centuries in the deep but recognisably wonderfully whole, her carving still upon her, her structure still sound enough to hold together, an entire ship of a vanished age brought back from the bottom of the sea. Crowds gathered to watch, as crowds had gathered 3 centuries before to watch her sink, and this time what they witnessed was not a disaster, but a resurrection, the return of the great ship from her long burial, one of the most remarkable recoveries of a lost thing that has ever been achieved. But even her raising was not the end of the labour, for a ship that has lain 3 centuries underwater cannot simply be lifted out and left to dry, or she will crack and warp and crumble as the water leaves her waterlogged timbers and the wood shrinks and distorts and falls apart. The soft, saturated oak of the ship had to be preserved, its water gradually replaced with something that would support the wood and keep it from collapsing as it dried, and this was a process not of days or weeks but of many years, of long and patient treatment during which the ship was continuously sprayed with a special preserving substance that slowly soaked into her timbers, driving out the water and taking its place, stabilising the ancient wood so that it could at last be allowed to dry without destroying itself. For the better part of 2 decades this treatment went on, the great ship tended and sprayed and cared for with enormous patience, while the preservative did its slow work deep in the grain of the oak. And when at last the long treatment was complete, and the ship was stable and dry and safe, she was given a home worthy of her, a great building raised up around her to shelter and display her, a museum built for the one purpose of housing the resurrected ship and allowing the world to come and see her. There, in that hall built around her, she stands today, the great ship drowned on her maiden voyage, and raised 3 centuries later, very nearly whole, the most complete survivor of her age of shipbuilding anywhere in the world, dim and dark and enormous in the cool preserving air, her carving still crowding her towering stern, her lions still snarling, a whole vanished world of craft and ambition brought back from the deep for us to stand before and wonder at. What the raising of the ship gave back to the world was far more than a hull and its carvings, for the mud that had held her for 3 centuries had kept, along with the great vessel herself, a vast multitude of small and ordinary things, and it is in these humble survivals that the ship speaks most intimately of the people who are aboard her. When a ship is lost and preserved so completely, she becomes a kind of accidental time capsule, sealing away in an instant the whole furniture of a moment, and when that moment is opened again after 300 years, what pours out is not the grand history of kings and navies, but the small history of daily life, the things people owned and used and carried, the intimate debris of ordinary existence. From the wreck and the mud around her came a wealth of such things, the belongings of the crew and of those who had sailed with them, sealed away since that August afternoon, and brought back into the light almost exactly as they had been left. There were the sea chests in which sailors kept their possessions, and within and around them the personal things a person of that time might own, clothing and shoes, tools and utensils, the small objects of a working life at sea. There were the vessels from which people ate and drank, the plates and tankards and spoons of everyday use. There were coins that someone had carried, and the games with which the idle hours were passed, and countless other small survivals, each one a direct and physical link to a particular human being who'd been aboard the ship on the day she died. There is something profoundly moving in these ordinary things, more moving in a way than all the grand carvings of the stern, for the carvings speak of the pride of a kingdom, while the small objects speak of the lives of individual people. People who are otherwise entirely lost to us, who left no other trace in history, whose names in most cases we will never know, but whose shoes and chests and cups we can hold in our hands. Here is the plate a sailor ate from. Here is the tool a craftsman worked with. Here is the small treasure someone kept in a chest. Through these things, the people of the ship reach across the centuries and touch us, no longer an abstract crew, but particular human beings with possessions and habits and small comforts. People who dressed in the morning and ate their meals and stowed their belongings, and then, on one bright afternoon, found themselves in the water as their great ship rolled over beneath them. The objects make them real in a way that no list of numbers could, and they remind us that the disaster, for all its scale and its place in history, was in the end a thing that happened to particular people, each with a life and a self, and belongings that they never returned to collect. Most poignant of all, and most solemn, were the human remains that the ship gave up. The bones of some of those who had died aboard her, and gone down with her, and lain within or beneath her all those centuries. When the ship was raised and searched, the skeletons of a number of people were found, the physical remains of some of the very individuals who had perished in the disaster, and these remains have been studied with great care and great respect, so that from the silent bones something of the lives they belonged to could be recovered. From a skeleton, the patient science of a later age can read a surprising amount: the age of the person, roughly, and whether they were a man or a woman, and something of their height and their build. The marks that a life of hard labour or of hardship, or of old injury or illness may have left upon the bones, even sometimes, hints about where a person grew up and what they ate and how they lived. And so, from the remains of the drowned, it has been possible to reconstruct something of who they were, to give back to these anonymous dead a measure of their individual humanity. To say of this one that he was a strong man in his prime who had known hard physical work, and of that one something else, each set of bones telling its own small fragment of a life. It is a strange and tender kind of resurrection, this reading of lives from bones 3 centuries after death, and it completes, in a way, the ship's return. For it restores to us not only the vessel and the objects, but, as far as such a thing can ever be done, the people themselves, or at least their bodies and the mute testimony of their bones. Among those who died, we should remember, were in all likelihood some of the wives and children and guests who had come aboard only for the celebration of the maiden voyage, and this gives the human remains an additional and particular sorrow. These were not sailors who had accepted the dangers of the sea as the condition of their trade. They were ordinary people, some of them perhaps quite young, who had come to share in a moment of pride and festivity, and who found themselves, without warning, in a sinking ship. That some of them did not survive is among the hardest facts of the whole story, and the possibility that among the recovered remains are those of such people, of the innocent celebrants of a day that turned to catastrophe, lends the bones a special weight. We cannot, in most cases, know the individual stories, cannot say who came aboard that day for joy and stayed for death, cannot give them back their names. But we can hold them in mind, these ordinary people caught in the great disaster, and we can let the ship, which was built to proclaim the glory of a kingdom, speak also through the humble evidence of the objects and the bones, of the ordinary human lives that were bound up in her fate. Taken altogether, the small survivals of the ship amount to something quite extraordinary. A picture of everyday life aboard a great warship of the early 17th century, of a completeness that exists nowhere else, a window onto a vanished world of a clarity that no document could provide. Written records tell us of kings and battles and the grand movements of history, but they rarely tell us what an ordinary sailor kept in his chest, or what he ate from, or how he passed his idle hours, or what his shoes were like, and these are precisely the things that the ship sealed and preserved in the mud kept safe and gave back. Through her we can see, with our own eyes, the texture of a life that would otherwise be entirely lost to us, and in seeing it we are reminded that history is not only the doings of the great, but the living of the small, the daily existence of countless ordinary people who left no name but who were, each of them, as real and as present to themselves as we are to ourselves. The great ship, built to be a monument to power, has become instead a monument to ordinary life, a keeper of the small and human things, and in that transformation there is a kind of quiet justice, as though the sea, in taking the proud vessel and holding her all those years, had chosen to preserve not the glory she was made for, but the humbler and more lasting truth of the people who sailed and died in her. Since the day she was raised, the great ship has been not only a wonder to look upon, but a teacher, and the study of her has added enormously to what we know about the ships and the seafaring of her age. For she is not a model, or a reconstruction, or a set of drawings, but the thing itself, a whole ship of the early 17th century preserved for close and patient examination. Before she was raised, much of what was known about the building of such vessels came from scattered documents, from the occasional plan or treatise, from the reckonings and rules that survived, and from the interpretation of wrecks too decayed to tell their full story. But here, suddenly, was a complete ship, or very nearly so, that could be measured and examined in every part, her construction laid bare, her methods of building visible in the very timbers, the marks of the shipwrights' tools still upon the wood. From her, scholars could learn how the great hulls of that age were actually put together, how the frames were shaped and joined, how the planking was fastened, how the decks were laid, how the whole enormous structure was raised and held together, in a detail that no document could ever supply. She became a primary source of a rare and precious kind, an original text in wood, and the reading of her has occupied and rewarded those who study the history of shipbuilding ever since, filling in with hard physical evidence what had before been a matter of inference and guess. And she has taught, too, the very lesson of her own destruction, for the study of the raised ship allowed the causes of her sinking to be examined at last with a thoroughness impossible in her own day. By measuring and analysing the actual vessel, by considering her proportions and her weights, and the way she was ballasted and armed, it became possible to understand with real precision why she'd been so unstable, to confirm and to refine the essential truth that had been dimly grasped at the inquest 3 centuries before. The ship, examined in the modern age, told plainly the story of her own flaw, the too narrow hull, the excess of weight carried high, the insufficient and unfixable ballast, the fatal imbalance built into her from the start. In this she became a kind of case study, an object lesson in the dangers of building beyond the limits of what the craft of an age can safely judge, studied not only by historians but by those interested in the principles of stability and the reasons that ships float or fail to float. There is a certain irony, gentle and instructive, in the way the ship that failed so completely has become, through that very failure and her long preservation, one of the most valuable teachers of how ships should and should not be built. Her disaster transformed across the centuries into knowledge. Yet even now, even with the whole ship before us to measure and study, there remain things about her that are debated and uncertain, questions that the physical evidence has narrowed but not entirely closed. And it is honest and right to acknowledge these open questions rather than to pretend that the raised ship has answered everything. The precise dimensions of the vessel, the exact figures for her length and her breadth, and her various measurements, are things that can now be established far more closely than before, and yet even here there is room for the small variations that come from where and how one measures, and from the changes the ship has undergone in her centuries underwater and her long conservation since. The exact number of those who died when she sank remains, as we have seen, uncertain, a matter of estimate rather than firm record. The precise sequence of the final minutes, the exact strength and pattern of the wind that took her, the details of what was done aboard as she began to heal, these are reconstructed from accounts that do not entirely agree and cannot now be perfectly resolved. And the deeper questions of responsibility, of exactly how and by whose decisions the fatal design came about, of how much the king himself shaped the flaw that doomed her, remain matters of interpretation, argued over by historians, incapable of a final and certain answer. The ship has told us a great deal, but she has not told us everything, and some of her secrets she has kept, and it is better to rest honestly in those open questions, to say plainly that here we do not know for certain, than to force a false precision onto a past that will not fully yield it. There is, moreover, a quieter and more anxious story that has unfolded in the decades since the ship was raised, a story of the continuing struggle to preserve her, for a ship saved from the sea is not saved once and for all but must be cared for endlessly, and her survival above the water has proved to require as much patience and ingenuity as her raising. The ancient waterlogged wood, stabilised though it was by the long years of treatment, remains fragile and vulnerable, subject to the slow chemistry of decay, and over the years since her raising, various threats to her long-term preservation have emerged and had to be understood and fought. There have been concerns about substances that accumulated in her timbers during her centuries in the harbour, and that can, under certain conditions, work to damage the wood from within, and about the effects of the very air and light and moisture of the hall in which she stands, and about the slow, settling and straining of her great structure under its own weight now that the water no longer supports it. The care of the ship has become an ongoing labour of science and vigilance, a constant monitoring and adjusting and intervening to slow the processes that would, if left alone, gradually consume her, so that the vessel that took 3 centuries to be found and years to raise and preserve now requires a perpetual watchfulness to keep. It is a humbling thing, this endless care, a reminder that the ship's survival is not a finished triumph but a continuing effort, that she has been not so much saved as placed under a permanent guardianship, and that the generations who come to marvel at her owe her in return the ceaseless attention that keeps her whole. In this too there is something fitting, something that rhymes with the whole long story of the ship, for she has always demanded enormous effort, always been an object into which vast labour was poured. Hundreds of men laboured for years to build her. Brave salvagers descended into the dark to strip her of her guns. A patient searcher spent years to find her. Divers dug beneath her in the mud to raise her. The preservers tended her for 2 decades to keep her from crumbling, and now the guardians of the museum watch over her without end to hold her against the slow ruin of time. She has been, from her first day to her latest, a focus of human labour and care and ingenuity out of all proportion to any use she ever served, for she never fought a battle, never carried a cargo, never did any of the things she was built to do, and yet she has commanded across 4 centuries an extraordinary devotion of human effort. Perhaps that is the strangest thing about her, that a ship so useless in the practical sense, a ship that failed at the very first attempt to do the one thing she was made for, should have drawn to herself so much labour and love in her building, in her raising and in her endless keeping. She is a monument in the end, not to power, which she never wielded, nor to victory, which she never won, but to something harder to name, to the human capacity for ambition, and for craft and for care, for the reaching after great things, and when those things are lost, for the patient labour of finding and saving and remembering them. And so we come, at the last, to the meaning of it all, or to as much of a meaning as a story like this one will ever yield. For the tale of the great ship is not a fable with a tidy lesson pinned to its end, but a true thing that happened, rich and strange and sad, and true things resist being reduced to a single moral. Still, having followed her from the felling of the forest to the hall where she stands today, we may pause and reflect, quietly, on what her long story seems to say, on the themes that run through it like the grain through her ancient oak. There is, first and most plainly, the theme of ambition, of the reaching after greatness, and of the double edge that ambition always carries. The ship was born of a magnificent ambition, the desire of a king and a kingdom to build the greatest and most beautiful warship of the age, and that ambition produced something genuinely wonderful, a vessel of extraordinary artistry and power, a thing worth building and worth admiring. But the same ambition, pressing past the limits of what the craft of the time could safely deliver, also produced the flaw that destroyed her, the reaching for 2 decks of guns and a towering carved stern upon a hull that could not bear them. Ambition built her, and ambition sank her, and it is impossible to separate the one from the other, for the very qualities that made her magnificent were the qualities that made her unstable, and had she been a humbler and safer ship she would also have been a lesser one. There is a hard truth in that, about the price that reaching for greatness so often exacts, and about how the same impulse that raises us up may, if it is not tempered by a proper respect for limits, cast us down. There is secondly the theme of craft and its limits, of the gap between what we wish to make and what our skill and knowledge will actually allow. The builders of the ship were not fools or bunglers. They were skilled men working at the edge of their art, and their failure was not a failure of care or of competence in the ordinary sense, but a failure of knowledge, of venturing into territory where the accumulated wisdom of their craft no longer held, and where they had no way to know how far past the safe limits they had gone. They lacked the means to calculate what they were attempting, and so they guessed, as skillfully as they could, and their guess was wrong, and a ship was lost and people died. It is a sobering reminder of how much of human making, across the long history of our building and inventing, has been a matter of proceeding by rule of thumb and hope into the unknown, of pushing against limits we could not measure, and of learning the hard boundaries of the possible only by crossing them at our cost. The ship stands for all the great overreachings of craft, all the times humankind has attempted more than it yet knew how to do, and has failed, and has learned from the failure. Her sinking was, among other things, a lesson written in disaster, a hard-won piece of the slow human education in what wood and water will and will not allow, and though the lesson came too late for her and for those who died in her, it was, in the long run, learned. There is, thirdly and most pervasively, the theme of water itself, of the sea, patient and indifferent and utterly without regard for human pride, which was the true antagonist of the whole story, not through any malice but simply through its unchanging nature. All the ambition of the king, all the artistry of the carvers, all the treasure of the guns, all the labour of the builders, meant nothing to the water, which asked only whether the ship was balanced rightly upon it, and finding that she was not, took her, calmly, without drama, in a few minutes of a fine afternoon. The sea does not care how many lions are carved upon a hull, or how many emperors gaze from astern. It applies its single indifferent test, the test of weight and balance and buoyancy, and it renders its verdict without appeal. And yet the same indifferent sea, having drowned the ship, then preserved her, holding her safe and whole in its cold dark embrace through 3 centuries, keeping her carvings and her timbers and the humble belongings of her crew against a day of finding that no one could foresee. The water was both the destroyer and the keeper, both the grave and the guardian, and in that double role there is something that goes beyond any simple opposition of enemy and friend, something more like the vast impersonal patience of the natural world, which takes and keeps and gives back according to its own nature and not according to our wishes or our griefs. The ship's whole existence, her building and her sinking and her long preservation and her raising, is in a sense a story about the meeting of human ambition with that patient indifference of water, and about how, in the very long run, the two can produce, out of disaster, something that neither intended, a preserved wonder, a gift across the centuries, a ship raised from the dead. And there is, running beneath all of these, the theme of the long line of human hands, the countless people whose labour and skill and care have touched the ship across 4 centuries, from the first shipwrights to the last conservators, a line of builders and searchers and keepers stretching unbroken from her making to our own day. When we stand before the ship now in the dim hall built around her, we are standing at the near end of that long line, the latest of the generations who have laboured over her or come to wonder at her, and behind us stretch all the others, the men who felled the oaks and shaped the timbers, the sculptors who carved the lions, the sailors who died in her, the salvagers who stripped her guns, the searcher who found her, the divers who raised her, the preservers who saved her, an immense human company gathered across the centuries around this single ship. She connects us to all of them, links our moment to theirs, lets us reach across 400 years and touch, in the very grain of her wood, the mark of a tool held by a hand long since dust. That is perhaps the deepest gift of her survival. This connection across time, this making present of the past, this quiet insistence that the people of that distant age were real, that they built and sailed and died, that they mattered and that something of them endures. The ship is a bridge across the centuries, and to stand upon it is to feel, for a moment, the long continuity of human making and human loss and human remembering, the way we are bound to those who came before us by the things they made and the things that survived them. It is worth reflecting too, before we close, on the peculiar way this ship has come to be remembered, for her fame across the centuries rests entirely upon her failure, and there is a lesson of a gentler sort in that as well. Had she sailed successfully, had she gone on to a long and useful career, fought her battles, served her decades, and been broken up in the end like nearly every other ship of her age, she would be today at most a name in the naval records, one great vessel among many, remembered by scholars and forgotten by everyone else. It is precisely because she failed, and failed so spectacularly and so completely, that she survives and is known, that hundreds of thousands come from every corner of the world to stand before her, that her name is spoken far beyond the kingdom that built her. Her disaster made her famous. Her sinking preserved her. Her failure is the whole reason we remember her at all. There is a strange consolation in that, and a strange reversal of the ordinary way of things, for we are used to thinking that success is remembered and failure forgotten. And here is a case where the very opposite is true, where the failure endures precisely because it was a failure, kept safe by the sea and raised at last into a fame far greater than any success would have brought her. The proud vessels that sailed and served and succeeded are gone, worn out and broken up and scattered, remembered by almost no one. The one that fell over on her first afternoon endures, whole and wondered at, 4 centuries on. And perhaps there is comfort in that thought for anyone who has ever failed at something into which they poured their whole heart, which is to say, for very nearly everyone. The great ship reminds us that failure is not always the end of a story, that what is lost is not always lost forever, that even the most complete and public of disasters may, in the fullness of time and by ways no one could foresee, be transformed into something of lasting worth. The men who built her died believing, most of them, that their great labour had come to nothing, that the ship they had raised with such effort had been a catastrophe and a shame. They could not know that their work would outlast every successful ship of their age, that the very timbers they shaped would be marvelled at by generations far in the future, that their failure would become, across the centuries, a treasure. There is a patience in that which is worth carrying away, a reminder that we cannot always see, from where we stand, what our efforts and even our failures will finally come to mean, and that the sea of time, like the sea that held the ship, has a way of keeping and returning things that seemed, in the moment of their loss, to be gone for good. Let us end, then, where such a story should end, not with a lesson, but with an image, a last quiet picture to carry away into the dark. Imagine the great ship as she stands today, in the cool, dim hall built for her, enormous and silent, her towering stern crowded with its carved figures, her lions still poised as if to spring, her ancient timbers dark and whole, lit softly in the shadowed air. Around her the visitors move quietly, small beneath her great bulk, gazing up at the vessel that was drowned on her first afternoon, and raised 3 centuries later, and the hall is hushed, as such places are, with the particular hush of the presence of something very old and very moving. And then imagine, beyond the walls of that hall, the water of the harbour where she was launched and where she sank, the same water still, moving as it has always moved, catching the light, lapping at the quays, going on with its endless indifferent life over the very place where the great ship once lay for 300 years in the dark. The ship is safe now, in her hall, out of the water at last, cared for and wondered at, but the water remains, patient as ever, and upon it the light plays as it played on that fine August afternoon so long ago, when a whole city gathered to watch the pride of the fleet set sail, and the great ship spread her canvas and glided out for a few short minutes into the sunlight, and leaned, and filled, and went down into the quiet keeping of the sea, from which, against all hope, she would one day rise again. If these slow voyages into the histories of the great ships bring you some measure of calm as the day ends, you are always welcome to return whenever you wish, for there are many more such stories to be told, other vessels and other seas and other ages, each waiting quietly for a night when you would like to drift among them. There is nothing to do now but rest. Let the image of the great ship in her silent hall and the light upon the patient water beyond stay gently with you as you let go of the day, and may your sleep be deep and easy and untroubled until the morning comes.